I want to thank you all for coming. You've put up with another series of these. This is the last in the series. As I said, they're all based on collections of material which are here in the Westfield Athenaeum. And in large part, they exist to let people know what's here and what you can do. So let's start off with a simple truism. Voltaire, the great French philosopher, said, all history is the lie agreed upon. And to a certain extent, you don't have to be cynical to understand what that means. To some extent, whatever we know about the historical past is based on the records that survive. And those records always have problems with them. Now, we've got a variety of records that exist in here. We've got the newspapers of the day. We've got the town meeting reports. They're here from those eras, so we can see what the official position was in their regular town meetings. Then we've got collections of letters. An album of letters down, and you can see letters that soldiers wrote home, and there's one collection of letters here. We've got another interesting collection. The veterans, after the war, formed an organization known as the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. And they formed a veterans post here in town, and that post survived until 1921. The veterans had a edifice in their lodge home which included photographs of the veterans. That object is in the upper museum. It's too big to haul down here, but it includes photographs of the veterans. Now, most of them are photographs that were taken in their old age. But some of the veterans included photographs of them in their uniforms. They had them when they went off to war. And the names are all identified. They're identified on the photographs. Arrangements can be made for you to see those if you wish. In addition, the veterans created this, which is a ledger with a separate page for each veteran of the post, in which was supposed to be inscribed the history of their military experiences. And we have that. We have him. Now, many of you remember a good many years, but Huck was a veteran of World War II, and he was determined to somehow preserve the history of all Westfield veterans of all wars. And he began that program 40 years ago, first of all culminating in a little book that he produced called Westfield's 300, which was the veterans of the Revolutionary War. And then one called Westfield's 500, which was the record of 513 veterans that he identified from the Civil War. Now, Huck was for cajoling other people to work for him. And one of the people that he got involved was myself, but more significantly, Ralph Cordes, that many of you may remember. He got Ralph involved to back him up and do a lot of his legwork and a lot of other work. And the two of them took that collection of veterans' photographs, made sure they could put a name to every photograph, then went in the search of the veterans' records and put those with the photographs, and then went and found the gravestones for those veterans if they were buried in Westfield. Records are all in the archives here also. So here, for instance, is a veteran photograph of a veteran that I'm going to talk about quite a bit because this man is important to the story. Here's his gravestone in Pine Hill Cemetery and his record of service. So we've got that a variety of odds and ends of records that the veterans preserved, and we've got photographs. Now, I brought some here, and I'm going to start my story today with this photograph on the end. And this thing, every time I turn my head around, I fade in and out. Hope you will be able to get a closer look at this photograph. In May 1871, Westfield dedicated its Civil War monument right out in front of the library here. This is the monument. This is a group of Westfield veterans as an honor guard, the Civil War veterans in front of the monument in May 1871 as they were taken. This is the last call. This is a photograph of 1922. The last Civil War veterans in Westfield had their last meeting. The men are all in their late 80s and 90s by this point. Within the next year, 12 of them will be dead. In 1930, start with this monument of 1871. If all is the lie agreed upon, and there are lots of reasons for that, there are some facts in history. And that monument is a fact. It's a very important monument. It's set up and dedicated to Westfield's dead in the Civil War. Nobody does these days, but if you want to walk over to it and get close to it, you will see that there are 6 names engraved on the base of that monument with the unit that those. Now, 60, big number. Westfield's population at the time was about 6,000 people. One of the things that I've done is I've taken a close look at those 66 dead men from the war. 20 of them died of years of war. Half of the men died of starvation and disease. Of the 66, half of them died of starvation and disease. I assume you know that in the Civil War, many more died of disease than died of combat. 3/4 of the men died in just 4 military units that were heavily made up of men from western Massachusetts. That's the 10th Regiment, the 27th Regiment, the 34th Regiment, and the 2nd Mass Heavy Artillery. Those 4 units were the ones in which all Westfield men died. Now, put that into comparison. Westfield's population was 6,000. The population of the United States at the time was about 30 million. 1/10 of today. Total dead in the war, North and South, is about 650,000. Now, you want to know what the impact would be? There's some chairs up here. Multiply by 10. It would be as if we had a 4-year war today, million dead. More in the Civil War than in all our other wars together, if you just look at combat deaths. If you look at every accident and everything else, you can add all up the rest. It's slightly more than the Civil War. And as it was. So 66 become terribly important. But there's a problem with our fact. Because it also says that Elisha Griggs, 3 other men's names on that record were not from Westfield. Served in the 2nd Mass Heavy Artillery with many other Westfield men from Westfield. Now, that Mass Heavy Artillery is a unique unit. Heavy artillery were the guns in meant was, if you got assigned to that, you had soft duty. Your life wasn't threatened. You could you could live comfortably in Washington, and you didn't have to do any of the things that soldiers ordinarily did. The only way you could get into the heavy artillery is if you had already served in another unit and finished your service, and then you could enlist in the heavy artillery. In late 1862, Massachusetts created a 9-month, and I'll explain that in a minute, a 9-month military unit called the 46th Mass. And about 70 men from Westfield signed up for it. 9 months meant by the time you'd gotten organized, you'd gotten trained, the artillery, because it was soft duty and you got paid and everything was taken care of nicely. In 1864, when Grant towards Richmond, that's when 1/2 of the total dead in the Civil War take place, is in the spring and summer of 1864. That's the bloody series of battles, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor. That's the bad stuff. The Union Army lost 100,000 men in 3 months' time. They were desperate for new men. So they ran and threw them into combat. The 2nd Regiment of the Heavy Artillery was assigned to North Carolina. And they got cut off and captured and all sent to Andersonville prison as prisoners of war. Of the 66 names on that monument, 10 are from the unit who died in Andersonville. So Brewer was in a heavily Westfield. There was another Westfield man with them. Shepard Proven was in the 2nd Heavy Artillery. He was from Westfield. Unlike Brewer, who wasn't, he was from Westfield. His family was in Westfield. He had served in the 46th, enlisted in the 2nd, was captured in North Carolina, was sent to Andersonville, died in Andersonville. He's buried there. I've been to his gravesite, as was Huck Lamb. He's buried there in Andersonville. His name is not on the monument. His family members must have been standing there in May 1871. They knew he was dead. Why isn't he on the monument? And yet a man who's not from Westfield, a number of men who are not from Westfield are. So facts get complicated. Complication is even worse. Troops were gotten. In 1861, when the war broke out, the U.S. Army had 16,000 men in it. At the end of the war, 4 years later, it had 30,000 men in it. They decided not to fight the war with U.S. regular Army troops. They decided to fight the war with what we would call today National Guard troops. Now, the states wanted that because what would happen is you would raise a unit from Massachusetts and the governor got to appoint the officers. So it's a big patronage position. In total, about 1,000 regiments were formed during the Civil War. 70 were formed from Massachusetts. Now, a regiment supposedly had 1,000 men in it in 10 companies, labeled A through J. And usually, companies were raised locally. So we can say Company K, 10th Massachusetts, is the Westfield unit. We can say Company C of the 46th Massachusetts was a Westfield unit. That's the way you got your men. Those days, the idea was that governors appointed the regimental officers. That's colonels, lieutenant colonels, majors. Companies elected their officers. That's captains, lieutenants, sergeants. The men would elect from among their own number. That's the way it was done. Now, the Army wanted long service veterans. It wanted to get a veteran who was trained, disciplined, and then you could count on him when a battle came. Governors and soldiers wanted short-term enlistments. So the Army kept trying to get 3-year men. Governors kept creating regiments, 30-day regiments, 60-day regiments, 90-day regiments, 100-day regiments, 1-year regiments, 2-year regiments, and some 3-year regiments. So service could mean being in any one of these hodgepodge of units. If you could be a veteran and be in a 3-month, a 90-day regiment, which meant that by the time you got your equipment, your uniform, did some drill and everything else, it was time to come home. That was your service. Now, the further problem is records of these units are kept by sergeants. Sergeants in those days were usually semi-literate. So you've got a semi-literate person writing handwritten records, which then are copied and recopied and recopied. I'm going to tell you some problems with that later. All right, the war begins with Fort Sumter, first week in April 1861. On April 20th, about 10 days later, Westfield has a mass meeting to get troops to defend the nation. 75 men enlist, and they're marched to Springfield, where they're going to get organized. And the first part of their organization is to elect their officers. They very quickly elect an old veteran, Colonel Wakely, as he's known, as their captain. Wakely was the head of the Westfield Brick Works. He had seen service in the Florida Wars back in the 1830s. He's really too old for this, but they didn't worry about it in those days. So he's elected captain. Now they're going to elect a lieutenant, and they had two men competing for the post. One was a fellow by the name of Pliny Woods, and the other is this man, Campbell. Campbell lost. They then decided to elect the second lieutenant. They then elected the sergeant. Man was elected. Andrew Campbell lost even more. So they're all down in Springfield now. They've elected their officers. They're ready to go when a surprise happens. And so he announced that Andrew Campbell would be the new lieutenant of the force. The Westfield men revolted. They left the grounds in Springfield and started marching back to Westfield. They quit. Other troops were called out and surrounded the Westfield men and marched them back to Springfield and put them in the guardhouse. Westfield participation in the war starts out inauspiciously. Well, there's negotiation back and forth, and finally the decision is made that a third man will become the lieutenant. Neither Andrew Campbell or Pliny Wood will be the lieutenant. Pliny Wood continues to serve and is killed a year later. Andrew Campbell says, I'm taking my toys and going home, and he comes back to Westfield, where he gets appointed to a job as a tax collector in Westfield. Now, what I did is I looked at a group of men, the 535. Now, Westfield was supposed to get 578 men total during the war. There's a chair up here if you wish. How troops were raised is the federal government would say, okay, I need They would divide that call, that's what it was called, a call, up among the states based on population. And so Massachusetts might be said, all right, on this call, you owe us. Governor of Massachusetts would then based on population. Well, that's how they raised troops. Each town had to meet the total war. Westfield's quota was 578 men. According to the records of the state, it Lamb has who served. Service realistically is in all American wars. The poorest, the youngest, and the least committed. There were 9 professional men identified in the 513. That's doctors, lawyers, ministers, and businessmen. There are only 9. All 9 were officers. And by the way, if you standard, there were 2 school teachers, and there were 10 age of these men, 145. Of you who have done military service, active military service in combat conditions, know that anybody who's 40 years old or older is not going to function very well in military service. All 63, they get in the 1863 draft Westfield, there were almost 1,000 men eligible. Now that word eligible them were called, given exemptions. 2 were found to be dead. 4 fled. 6 immediately enlisted, and there were only 21 left to be drafted. Westfield and the way troops were gotten, Westfield participated in another thing. If you were drafted or called, essentially forming clubs to pool their resources. So if any member got drafted, instead of it was a club of 6 men, then it would only cost you $3 draft. Only the 6 men who enlisted and 5 more were gotten. They got out of 1,000 on the list. I told you the records were bad. Well, as Huck began trying to sort out these men, now what he did is he went to the state records, Massachusetts soldiers and sailors in the Civil War, state records. He went to the newspaper records. He went to the monument. He went to the list the GAR produced. He went to every list he could get. Men like Chauncey R. Gross, and for the rest of his career lived in town as Chauncey R. Chauncey. And then we've got the case of Leroy Andrews. Leroy Andrews is listed as Lyman Andrews, Luman Andrews, Luman Andrus, Putt Andrus, and is buried in Pine Hill as Luman Andrus. But it's the same service record. Are we dealing with 6 different men or one guy whose name got spelled slightly different on different records? Take your pick. Why so many problems in Westfield? Westfield had a history of know-nothingism. Now, that's another piece of history. In the 1850s, there was a political movement in the United States which was, for a very brief time, swept the nation, dominated the politics of Massachusetts, called the Know-Nothing Party. It was because it was a secret party, and if you were asked any questions about it, you were supposed to respond, "I know nothing." So they're called the Know-Nothings. It was a weird party with 2 blocks in it. There were a group of abolitionists, those who opposed the slavery. And then the other group were those who opposed immigrants and Catholics. So it was a massive nativist, patriotic, anti-foreigner, anti-Catholic, anti-slavery, anti-South party. Problem is, Westfield had a large Irish Catholic minority. So they saw this party, and it was their deadly enemy. They saw anyone connected with it as the enemy. Well, the other part of the party were abolitionists. So as far as this Irish Catholic minority in Westfield was, if you were for blacks, if you were an abolitionist, you were an enemy. Therefore, blacks were the enemy. Therefore, anybody who's anti-black is good. How important was that? In the election that elected Lincoln in 1861, 13% of the voters in Westfield voted for the states' rights Southern Party, the party of Breckinridge. 13% voted for the party that says we're leaving this union and creating the Confederacy. There's a strong pro-Confederate element in town. Lincoln carried Westfield. Westfield had one of the lowest percentages in the governor's election. The governor, a man by the name of Andrews, was an abolitionist, an ex-member of the Know-Nothing Party, pro-Civil War, pro-Lincoln Republican. This town voted for the Democratic states' rights governor. This town voted overwhelmingly against him. In 1864, when we've been fighting the war for 3 years and Lincoln is up for re-election again, his opposition is General McClellan, representing the Democratic Party, on a platform of immediate ceasefire and talks with the South to solve this thing. McClellan nearly carried Westfield. He did carry the little surrounding small towns. This town is not enthusiastic about this war. Listings, it's not enthusiastic in its votes, it's not enthusiastic. statue that was put up in in 1862, came enlisted again, and he became the captain of Company C of the 46th. They organized, they were shipped to North Carolina, and he announced he was too sick to continue, and he came home and resigned. Campbell kind of disappeared. Although he was prominent in town, he's listed as a painter in town. He got elected as a state rep 2 terms later in the century. Died in 1898. But there's something wrong about his career, something unusual about him. If you go to his page in that book, it's on page 97. And as we get to the back of the book, by the way, these entries in the book were all put in as the post was collapsing. They decided to have a record of the post just as the post was folding in the beginning of the 20th century. And so they tried to capture the history of each of the men at that time, when most of the men were dead. Campbell is dead himself at this time, but here's what Campbell's entry says. Quote, "He held the rank of captain, regiment and company unknown, charter member 1868, dropped from the organization 1872, military record unknown." It's kind of unusual for the guy whose statue is standing out in the center of town, who was a state rep for 2 years, who spent his whole life in town, and who died only in 1898. Somehow, he's not seen important by his fellow veterans. There's something wrong here. What do we do? We've got a monument. A monument erected by a town that isn't enthusiastic about the war that the monument's commemorating. In fact, a town that has a minority within it that is opposed to the war and opposed to its causes. We've got a statue on the top erected to a man whose Civil War record is questionable at best, and certainly who does not have the best relations one would expect from his fellow veterans, and yet there his statue is 160 years later. 180 years later, sorry. We've got a dedication to the dead of Westfield. And yet we know some of them weren't dead. Some of them weren't from Westfield. And some of the Westfield dead aren't there. What do we do with it? Conclude with another saying by someone who is unrecorded but exists in a number of the books of aphorisms. History making is like sausage making. You never want to look too closely at the processes. Thank you very much. Comments or questions? Yes.
I'm actually from Wisconsin.
Yeah.
I was doing some research on a Wisconsin soldier killed in the cornfield at Antietam. Actually, he was mortally wounded, but he was from Westfield, and he was a shepherd. I think it was William Shepherd.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe his family came to Maryland when he was wounded, brought him back home, and he's buried in Pineville. Is he a monument?
I don't know. I've got these lists of names up here. All the lists are up here, and you can check with.
The third Wisconsin.
Well, Westfield men served in, I think, something like 30 or 40 different units. There's even a couple of men who served in the Navy. I concentrate on those 4 units because that's where almost all the casualties came from.
Just another question.
Yeah.
The topic. The 1864 election. Do you have any sense for the soldier votes from Massachusetts or from Westfield?
As far as I'm aware, heavily pro-Lincoln in general. Assumption that would be Massachusetts. So that time assumed that the soldiers would be so happy to get home that they would vote in the war. Much, we're going to carry it to the end. What I do know is that in western Massachusetts, west of the river, I'm not talking about Springfield, west of the river, this is not a hotbed of abolitionism, this is not a hotbed of pro-Lincoln. This is a very conservative part of the country. And by the way, I've given talks on the Revolutionary War. It's the exact same thing. You see this consistently in this region. Shays' Rebellion and all the rest of that. Yeah.
Is that reflected in Fugitive Slave Act and Underground Railroad? I mean, you think of the Connecticut River,
Springfield was a stronghold of the Underground Railroad. John Brown, and there was a black community there that ran their own underground. It's very big field. I've been involved in doing this kind of stuff for 40 years here in town, and dozens of times people have come up to me and said, I live in a house, and in my house the Underground Railroad was here, I've got this kind of cell. There is only one piece of evidence about anything in the Underground Railroad in Westfield. And the son of, I got to get my whip manufacturer, Hiram Hull, I believe it is, the son of Hiram Hull, in his old age in the 1890s, talked about when he was a child, his father had a Underground Railroad station in the Spellman House on School Street and in Hull's property on Franklin Street, and he talked about one time that there were fugitive slaves there. And as far as I'm aware, that's the only record that exists of that. Westfield was not sympathetic in general, that kind of thing.
Well, I think in that same memoir, he says he used to do when blacks or escapes would come to town to his father, would sit in front of the barn with an axe on them. That was part of the memoir.
Yeah.
But like you say, it was years later.
Yeah. This memoir, by the way, that memoir is part of a multi-part article that the Springfield Republican did on the Underground Railroad in the Valley, and there's a lot of information in that, but that's the only Westfield reference. Yes?
Is there evidence that any to the Civil War in place of their owners? Are there any names?
Huck he found just a couple of newspaper accounts of blacks by first name enlisting. Remember, Massachusetts had two famous black regiments and what, one cavalry or two cavalry? Two cavalry? So, regiments here in Westfield. I can tell you this. Remember I said that Westfield is actually credited with 631 names associated with Westfield? A group of those are Southern slaves. Because that was one of the way that you got soldiers. Remember? Westfield's got a quota. It's got to come up with 50 names. How are we going to get 50 names? Okay, can I get 50 volunteers? No, I only got 6. So towns would create bonuses. They would say, okay, if you will volunteer from my town, I will pay you. It started out at $150, and then towns began to compete with each other. And the next town nearby would say, no, 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 we'll give you $200. So this got to two problems. One, it got to bounty jumpers. Guys who would enlist in a town, collect their bounty, go to camp, desert, then go to New Hampshire, collect a bounty there, desert, and that was very common. And the other thing is there were people who got jobs. Okay, you'll pay $150 a head for a bounty. I'll go out and I'll go get you and $100, and I'll take the 50 for myself. So that there were guys who went around, and what they were doing, they were meeting immigrant ships coming into Boston or New York Harbor and grabbing young men there, rounding up immigrants. Or by the time we got to 1863 and you could have black regiments, they were simply slaves are liberated in Louisiana. Okay, round up the slaves, and they're in the army now. And so I know that 20 to 30 black slaves from the South are credited to Westfield in those numbers. And that's, by the way, is one of the reasons why these names of the men dead on the monument, some of them are not from Westfield. They're credited to Westfield.
Just two quick things. There is no flavor in Massachusetts after 1783 when the new Constitution got the new Massachusetts Constitution. But there is a member of the 5th Mass Colored Cavalry who's buried in Pine Hill, who was in Texas for the Juneteenth proclamation. We're trying to feature him in the program.
Yeah. Some of you have heard me talk about the Peyton family in Westfield. Well, the 27th Mass Regiment went to North Carolina, to New Bern, North Carolina. That's where Peyton was from, right near there, the Peyton family. The Peyton family were slaves. And one company of the 27th was stationed in what was Peyton's hometown. When they came back, I believe that's how Philip Peyton Sr. came to Westfield. I believe that's how he got here. Now, soldiers here to Westfield. Peyton family developed. Yeah.
Know that the Ames had an entire train loaded with war materials ready to be shipped to the Confederacy, and the Civil War prevented it, so he turned around and sold the entire train to the Union.
Yeah, that was in the months before the war broke out. Many of the Confederate governments, the state governments, immediately began to establish contracts with industrialists in the North to round up munitions and all kinds of supplies. Very, very common. All right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.